She laughed when she slid the credit card across the small cafe table, a light, careless sound that came from a life cushioned by limits she never reached, and the laugh lingered longer than it should have, loud enough that the barista paused mid-pour and glanced over while the man sitting across from her stiffened, his shoulders tight beneath a worn jacket that had seen too many winters, his hands rough with the kind of cracks that told stories of labor no resume ever captured, his eyes darting briefly to the little girl asleep against his chest, her breath shallow, her small fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt as if even in sleep she was afraid of slipping away. She had only sat with him because there were no other tables, because her phone battery was dying, because he'd politely asked if the seat was taken, and somewhere between her second lat and his apology for taking up space, he'd confessed what she assumed was a rehearsed sob story, that he was a single dad, that his wife had died 2 years earlier, that he'd lost his job 3 months ago when the company downsized, that his daughter's asthma had worsened in the cold, and that the medicine the doctor prescribed cost more than he had left to his name. She listened with half an ear, nodding at the right moments, already framing the anecdote in her head as something she might repeat later, a strange encounter, a reminder to be grateful, and when he finally fell silent, eyes lowered in embarrassment, she surprised herself by reaching into her wallet and pulling out the card. "Relax," she said, smiling as she pushed it toward him, the metallic edge catching the cafe light. "Use it. Consider it a joke. Just don't buy a yacht." She expected a rush of gratitude, tears maybe, or a dramatic refusal she could wave away, but instead he froze, staring at the card like it was dangerous, like it might explode if he touched it. He shook his head at first, murmured that he couldn't, that it wasn't right, that he'd find another way, and only when she rolled her eyes and insisted did he finally reach out, fingers trembling as they brushed the plastic. He promised he'd only use what was absolutely necessary, promised he'd bring it back the next day, promised he wasn't that kind of man, and the way he said it, quiet and firm, made her feel oddly impatient, as if he were ruining the punchline by taking it too seriously. She waved him off, already glancing at her phone, already disengaging, and when he stood to leave, balancing his daughter carefully against his chest, he thanked her in a voice so low it sounded like a vow rather than gratitude. She watched him go for only a second before laughing again, shaking her head at the absurdity of it all, at the strange theater of poverty she'd stumbled into, telling herself that even if he vanished, even if he maxed the card, it was nothing she'd feel, nothing that would dent her life in any meaningful way, and as she stepped back into the comfort of her routine, she forgot his name, his face, and the weight behind his eyes almost instantly. Part 2. The laughter died the next afternoon when her phone began to buzz, first once, then again, then so rapidly it felt like it was vibrating straight through her palm and into her chest, and she frowned, annoyed more than anything as she unlocked the screen, only for her breath to catch as notification after notification stacked up, charges scrolling past faster than she could process them. A hospital billing department, a pharmacy, another pharmacy, a medical supply store, each amount larger than she'd expected, larger than she'd imagined he'd dare, and the annoyance twisted into something sharp and hot as she imagined him laughing now, imagined herself the punchline, imagined telling this story later with a bitter edge. She kept scrolling, heart pounding, seeing a charge for a used electronics store, a laptop, then software subscriptions, then a suit from a thrift shop that somehow still cost a few $100s, and just when she thought it was over, just when her anger peaked into something almost blinding, she saw the final charge, a business registration fee filed under his name, and the room seemed to tilt as she stared at it, her first instinct to call the bank, to freeze the card, to reclaim control. Instead, without fully understanding why, she grabbed her coat and went straight back to the cafe, rehearsing confrontations in her head, imagining his excuses, his lies, the satisfaction she'd feel demanding answers. She arrived breathless and furious, but the scene she found knocked the wind out of her anger because he was there already, not slumped and apologetic as she'd pictured, but standing straighter, his hair neatly combed, wearing the suit she now recognized, cheap but clean, his daughter beside him, awake and smiling, her cheeks flushed with color instead of strain, her breathing easy and unlabored as she laughed at something he whispered to her. When he saw her, he didn't flinch or flee, he simply nodded, as if he'd expected her, and gestured for her to sit. He listened as she spoke, as she demanded explanations, as she accused him of taking advantage of her joke, and when she finally ran out of words, he began to explain, calmly, carefully, laying out the truth piece by piece. The hospital charge, he said, was because they wouldn't release his daughter without payment after a severe attack the night before, the medicine because the cheaper alternatives no longer worked, the laptop because a remote contract job had finally come through after weeks of applications but required equipment he didn't have, the suit because he'd been called in for a last-minute in-person interview that morning, one he'd passed, and the business registration because the contract work would turn into something more if he could formalize the repair service he'd been planning for years, the one thing he'd sworn he'd never rush or cheapen. He slid the card back to her along with a folded piece of paper, a meticulous list of every expense, dates, amounts, reasons, and at the bottom, a repayment plan stretching months into the future, modest but realistic, and he said he understood if she was angry, that he understood if she wanted to press charges or report the card stolen, that he'd accept whatever consequences came, because all he'd done was take what was meant as a joke and turn it into a lifeline. As she listened, something inside her shifted, the anger dissolving into a heavy, unfamiliar regret, not because of the money, but because she realized how lightly she'd laughed at a man who carried responsibility like a constant weight, a man who hadn't spent a single cent on comfort or indulgence, only on survival and the fragile outline of a future. She looked at his daughter, alive and laughing because of charges she'd dismissed as pocket change, and felt smaller than she ever had, aware for the first time that the real cost of her joke wasn't reflected on her statement, but in the way it exposed the gap between who she thought she was and who she'd actually been.